Last season, you said Shedeur had a bunch of deficiencies, and he and Coach Prime overplayed their hand, in quote. Now you're back in Shedeur as a starter. Or was all that nonsense from last season a part of the negative narrative that most of you experts were spreading to feed an agenda?
I don't have an agenda. I'm not part of the media. Sean and I have a podcast. We're in his office. You can kill all that. I'm just reporting the things that I had heard. And it's obvious based on he was projected to be a
Cris Carter, Colin Coward, Rex Ryan, three of the biggest names in football media. Three men who spent an entire season telling you that Shadeur Sanders was not good enough, not ready, not the real thing. They questioned his arm. They questioned his father's influence. They questioned whether he even belonged in a first-round conversation. And now, every single one of them is walking it back. This is not a small story. This is one of the most coordinated media reversals we have seen around a young quarterback in years, and it is happening right now, right before the season kicks off. The question is not just whether they were wrong. The question is why they were so confident in the first place, and what it actually took to make them change their minds. Before we go any further, drop one word in the comments right now. Just one. Believer or doubter. Let us see where Gridiron Ground stands on Shadeur Sanders before we break this whole thing down.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
I didn't think they had the type of weapons that were going to be able to protect him, but I'm not surprised at all. Like, I thought he was going to be starting in his second year. I thought he was going to be a first-round pick, sit a little bit his first year, play a little bit, and then take over his second year. So I wouldn't be surprised at all with no strings attached. I believe Shedeur is going to win it. If you had asked me 2 months ago, I thought Deshaun still has some talent. But I think Shedeur has gotten his career back on the right track. I still want another weapon for him.
Here is something that does not happen often in football media. A Hall of Fame receiver, one of the most decorated and respected voices the sport has produced, sits down and tells you flat out that he got a player wrong. Not in a vague, carefully worded way designed to protect his reputation. In a direct, uncomfortable, this is on me kind of way. That is what Cris Carter just did with Shadeur Sanders, and the football world is still processing it. Carter spent last season as arguably the most prominent critic Shedeur had in national media. His commentary was not casual skepticism. It was pointed, and it was consistent. He raised serious doubts about whether Deion Sanders had actually prepared his son for the kind of adversity that separates quarterbacks who make it from those who wash out. He argued that Shedeur's production at Colorado, as impressive as the surface numbers looked, was built on a schedule that did not prepare him for what NFL scouts actually needed to evaluate. And he went further than almost anyone else when he reportedly compared Shadeur's profile to that of a fifth-round developmental arm, not a first-round prospect, not a future starter, a developmental arm. That specific comparison mattered more than people realized at the time. When a name like Carter attaches a label like that to a quarterback prospect, it does not stay isolated to one broadcast. It travels. Scouts talk. Front office personnel talk. Other analysts pick it up and start repeating versions of it without always checking whether it held up. Carter's platform gave that particular piece of criticism a credibility that made it extremely difficult for Shadeur's camp to counter, because you are not just arguing against an opinion at that point. You are arguing against a Hall of Famer's opinion, and that is a very different fight. But now Carter is telling a completely different story, and the way he is telling it is worth paying close attention to. He has reportedly made clear that he was not out there manufacturing negativity for its own sake. He did not wake up every morning looking for new ways to undercut Shadeur Sanders. What he is admitting, and this is the part that actually stands out, is that he let himself get shaped by a version of Shedeur that he had not personally verified. He accepted a consensus that was already forming around the player without doing his own homework first. And for someone with Carter's experience and reputation, that is a significant thing to acknowledge out loud. What finally changed his mind was not an argument. It was not a rebuttal from Shadeur's camp or a strongly worded response from Coach Prime. It was tape. Carter reportedly watched what Shedeur has been doing in training camp and off-season workouts, and what he saw did not match a single thing he had been saying for months. The command of the offense looked sharper. The decision-making looked faster. The confidence in the pocket looked earned rather than inherited. None of the old criticism held up once. He actually sat down and watched. When the evidence stops supporting your argument, you have two options. You dig in and keep repeating yourself, or you say you were wrong. Carter chose the harder road, and that choice is now forcing every other critic who followed his lead to figure out what they are going to do next. The thing about a powerful voice in sports media is that it rarely stays isolated. When Chris Carter spoke, people listened, and more importantly, other analysts started speaking in the same language. What began as one Hall of Famer's skepticism quietly became the dominant framework through which Shadeur Sanders was being evaluated across television, radio, and digital platforms. And by the time that framework had fully taken hold, it was almost impossible to discuss Shedeur without bumping into some version of it.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
The criticism that circulated last season broke down into a few recurring themes. There were questions about arm strength, specifically whether Shedeur had the kind of velocity to make the tight window throws that define success at the NFL level. There were questions about pocket presence, about whether he processed pressure quickly enough and moved through his reads with the efficiency that teams drafting in the first round needed to see. And then there was the more personal layer of the criticism, the suggestion that Shadeur's confidence in interviews and on social media reflected something closer to entitlement than genuine belief in his own preparation. That last piece was particularly interesting because it was never really about football. It was about perception. And once perception becomes part of the conversation around a young quarterback, it tends to stick in ways that pure football analysis does not, because it is harder to counter with statistics or tape. You cannot point to a completion percentage and use it to prove that someone is humble. So that particular line of criticism had staying power even when the football arguments around it were starting to weaken. What made the situation harder for Shedeur was that the criticism was not coming from anonymous corners of the internet. It was coming from credentialed people with major platforms, people who had played the game at the highest level or covered it for decades. That gave the narrative a legitimacy that filtered down into how casual fans talked about Shedeur and how some evaluators reportedly discussed him in private conversations. A prospect's draft stock is not built in a vacuum. It is shaped by the conversations happening around him, and those conversations last season were not kind. What is important to understand, though, is that the criticism was not entirely without a foundation. Shedeur did face real questions coming out of Colorado. The Buffaloes were not a dominant program. Some of his most impressive performances came against opponents that NFL scouts were not going to spend much time on. Those are legitimate observations. The problem was not that the questions existed. The problem was how far the commentary went beyond the questions and into definitive conclusions that the evidence did not actually support. Labeling a player a fifth-round arm is not a question. It is a verdict, and verdicts carry weight in a way that questions do not. Once that verdict was out there, attached to a credible name and repeated across multiple platforms, it became the lens through which a lot of people started watching Shadeur Sanders. And a lens like that distorts what you see because you are not watching the player anymore. You are watching for confirmation of the thing you already decided. That distortion is what is now being corrected, one reversal at a time. And the next one came from a very familiar voice. Colin Coward built his brand on certainty. Strong takes, confident delivery, minimal hedging. That is the formula that turned him into one of the most recognizable voices in sports media, and it is also the formula that made his commentary on Shadeur Sanders last season particularly damaging. Because when Coward spoke with that level of certainty about a player's limitations, it landed differently than it would from someone known for nuance or qualification. It landed as a conclusion. His central argument against Shedeur was rooted in the Colorado production question. The logic went something like this. Shedeur's numbers at Colorado were built against a level of competition that NFL teams could not use as a reliable measuring stick. The Pac-12 schedule, whatever version of it Colorado was playing during Deion Sanders' tenure, did not consistently feature the kind of defenses that would reveal whether Shedeur's tools were actually translatable. So the numbers, however impressive they looked on paper, told scouts very little about what they were actually getting. That was Coward's position, and he held it with the kind of conviction that made it sound less like analysis and more like settled fact. And it was not a completely unreasonable starting point. College production is always complicated to evaluate when the schedule does not include consistent high-end competition. Teams that have made mistakes in the draft have often done so by overweighting numbers generated against weaker opponents. So there was a legitimate conversation to be had about what Shedeur's Colorado tape actually proved. The issue was that Coward took that conversation and used it to draw conclusions that went well beyond what the available evidence justified. The confident dismissals are reportedly gone now. What is coming from Coward's direction instead is something that sounds almost unfamiliar given the tone he used last season. A wait-and-see quality has crept into his commentary. The certainty has been replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. And for anyone who has watched how Coward operates over the years, that shift is not subtle. When someone known for landing hard on a take starts leaving room for the take to change, that is a signal. It means the thing they were looking at is no longer cooperating with the original argument. What reportedly pushed Coward in this direction is similar to what moved Carter. It was not rhetoric or public pressure. It was what Shedeur has been doing in practice and in preseason work, operating with a level of command and precision that does not fit the profile of a quarterback who benefited from weak competition and daddy's coaching. When you watch a player process a defense quickly, go through progressions without hesitating, and get the ball out on time against competitive looks in camp settings, it becomes difficult to keep repeating a take that says he cannot do those things. Shedeur is not just showing flashes. According to multiple accounts from people who have been around these sessions, the consistency is what stands out. And consistency is exactly what Coward's version of the criticism said he would not have at the next level. There is still time for this season to reshape the conversation again in either direction. But right now, Coward's track is moving one way. And he is not the only one. Two more voices who hit even harder are next. Rex Ryan does not do subtle. His entire public identity is built on saying exactly what he thinks, louder than most people are comfortable with, and without much visible concern for how it lands. That quality made him compelling television for years. It also meant that when he locked onto Shadeur Sanders last season, the commentary did not stay in the realm of football analysis for very long. It got personal quickly. Ryan reportedly called Shedeur spoiled. The specific language he used and the framing around it suggested that the problem was not just football skill or draft readiness. The problem, in Ryan's telling, was character. The implication was that growing up as Deion Sanders' son, inside one of the most celebrated football families in the history of the sport, had produced a young quarterback who did not understand what it actually cost to earn a professional career. That Shedeur had been given things rather than having fought for them. And that gap in experience would show up eventually in the way it always shows up, under real pressure, when everything is on the line and nobody is going to rescue you. That kind of commentary is hard to walk back gracefully because it was never really about football in the first place. You cannot point to a completion percentage or a passer rating and use it to prove that someone is not spoiled. The accusation exists on a different level than the tape, which made it both harder to counter and harder to reverse once the reversal became necessary. And yet Ryan has reversed. The entitlement talk has quietly disappeared from his commentary, reportedly replaced by observations about Shedeur's football IQ and how he handles himself under pressure. That is not a small shift. That is a complete reframe. Going from talking about entitlement to talking about football IQ means you have essentially dropped the original argument entirely and started over with a different one. Ryan did not make a big public production out of the reversal. He just stopped saying the old things and started saying new ones, but anyone paying attention noticed. Tony Grossi's evolution followed a different path, but arrived at a similar destination. Grossi covers the Browns, which meant his criticism was not coming from the national media echo chamber. It was coming from inside the building, or at least from someone close enough to it that his observations carried a different kind of weight. He reportedly raised doubts throughout training camp and the preseason about whether Shedeur could hold up physically at the next level. When Shedeur was managing an arm issue early in camp, some of that commentary reportedly crossed into territory that observers felt was disproportionate given what Shedeur was actually dealing with. But the tape eventually made the old arguments untenable for Grossi as well. When you watch a quarterback you question physically start operating with the kind of command and efficiency that Shedeur has reportedly shown this offseason, you either keep repeating the old line or you update your read. Grossi updated his, not with fanfare, not with a public apology, but through a gradual shift in how he covered the player week over week. The pattern is unmistakable at this point. And one more voice from inside Cleveland's coverage circle completed the circle in her own quiet but telling way. There is a particular kind of credibility that comes from a beat reporter. It is different from the credibility that attaches to a national voice like Carter or Coward or Ryan, because a beat reporter is actually there. They are in the building. They are watching practice. They are talking to people inside the organization on a regular basis. When a beat reporter with that kind of access raises doubts about a player, it carries a specific weight, because the assumption is that they are not working from a distance or relying on second-hand information. They are seeing it firsthand. Mary Kay Cabot has that kind of reputation in Cleveland. She has covered the Browns for long enough that people inside and outside the organization treat her observations as meaningful data points, not just opinion. So when her coverage of Shedeur last season reflected doubt, it was not easy to dismiss. And when her coverage started shifting, that shift was equally hard to ignore. The pattern reportedly followed a specific rhythm. Every time a report would surface suggesting Shedeur was not ready, or that questions remained about some aspect of his game, Shedeur would answer it with a performance. Not always dramatically, not always in a way that made headlines, but consistently enough that the doubt kept getting undercut by what was actually happening on the field. And a reporter who is watching that happen in real time has to decide at some point whether to keep repeating the old questions or to acknowledge that the answers are piling up. Cabot reportedly made that acknowledgement gradually. Her coverage trended more favorable as the offseason progressed, and Shedeur continued to deliver the kind of work in practice that made the earlier reservations harder to sustain. This was not a dramatic reversal, and it did not come with any public statement about getting it wrong. It came through the accumulation of positive observations that started showing up in her reporting more frequently, while the skeptical framing began to fade. What makes Cabot's shift particularly significant is the context in which it happened. She is not covering Shedeur from New York or Los Angeles and making judgments based on clips and second-hand reports. She is in Cleveland, talking to people who are around Shedeur every single day. When her red starts moving in a positive direction, that is not just one person changing their mind. That is a reflection of what the people closest to the situation are seeing and saying. And that matters enormously for how the rest of the league processes information about Shadeur Sanders going forward. National voices carry reach, but local beat voices carry proximity. When both are moving in the same direction, the old narrative does not just weaken, it collapses, because there is nowhere left for it to live. The question that nobody has really answered yet is what it cost Shedeur to get here. The reversals are happening. The media landscape around him is transforming in real time. But all of this is being discussed as though the criticism last season was simply a miscalculation, a reasonable mistake made by smart people who looked at incomplete information and drew the wrong conclusions. That framing leaves out the most important part of this story, which is how Shedeur actually handled being on the receiving end of all of it. That part deserves its own examination, because what he did in response to everything thrown at him last season is what actually made these reversals inevitable. There is a version of this story where Shadeur Sanders fires back, where he uses his platform, his visibility, and his family name to push back directly on the people questioning him. Carter makes a comment about fifth-round development arms, and Shedeur responds on social media. Coward dismisses his Colorado production, and Shedeur calls it out in a press conference. Ryan talks about entitlement, and Shedeur uses his next interview to explain exactly why that framing was unfair. That version would have been understandable. Most 20-year-olds in his position, facing that level of public criticism from people with that kind of reach, would have said something. The temptation to respond when someone is mischaracterizing you in front of millions of people is not a weakness. It is a completely human reaction. And given who his father is, given that Deion Sanders built a significant part of his own brand on saying exactly what he felt and making sure the world heard it, the expectation from a lot of observers was probably that Shedeur would follow that same instinct. He did not. Not once, reportedly, did Shedeur respond to Carter by name. He did not call out Coward. He did not engage with Ryan's entitlement narrative in any direct way. He did not turn Tony Grossi's coverage into a public argument. He handled his media obligations professionally, showed up to practice, and did his work. And then he let the work do whatever talking needed to be done. That restraint is not a small thing. In an environment where social media has made it easier than ever for athletes to respond instantly to criticism, where a single post can redirect an entire news cycle, choosing silence as a strategy requires a specific kind of discipline. It means you have to be genuinely comfortable with people saying things about you that you know are wrong, and you have to trust that the right response is not a rebuttal but a performance. That is a remarkably mature operating principle for any player, let alone one navigating his first full year as a professional starter. The organizational read on Shedeur reportedly reflects exactly this quality. The Browns are not just betting on his arm, they are betting on his temperament. And his response to last season's criticism gave the front office significant data about whether that temperament was real or just a managed image. You can perform composure in a press conference. It is much harder to perform it across an entire season of sustained criticism from major platforms without letting it affect your preparation or your relationships inside the building. There are reports suggesting that Shedeur's focus never wavered internally even as the external noise reached its loudest points. He reportedly stayed connected to the film room, remained engaged with his coaches, and continued treating every practice rep as though his development depended on it, because it did. And that consistency in the face of real adversity is part of what made the organizational commitment to him feel stable rather than speculative. The critics were watching for cracks and never found any, so they started looking more carefully at the tape instead. And the tape told them something very different from what they had been saying, which is exactly where Shedeur needed them to end up. At some point, a media reversal stops being just a media story and becomes a football story. And that is exactly where this one has arrived. The shift in how Carter, Coward, Ryan, Grossi, and Cabot are now talking about Shedeur Sanders is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in direct relationship to what the Cleveland Browns have built around him, and what the organization clearly expects from him going forward. The Browns did not draft Shedeur with significant capital, and then spend the offseason shoring up the roster around him, because they were unsure about their quarterback. That is not how franchise building works at the organizational level. When a front office commits to a player the way Cleveland has committed to Shedeur, it reflects an internal evaluation that is fundamentally different from the one that Carter was articulating publicly last season. And when those two evaluations are that far apart, eventually one of them has to give. The media evaluation gave, the organizational one held. What the Browns have reportedly seen from Shedeur in training and off-season work aligns with what the reversals in media coverage are now reflecting. The command of the offense has improved measurably. His communication with receivers and his understanding of the scheme has deepened in ways that coaches apparently expected would take longer to develop. The quick decision-making, the ability to go through progressions without locking onto the first read, the willingness to take the check down when the right time comes rather than forcing the ball into coverage. Those are the things that separate a legitimate starting quarterback from the kind of developmental prospect Carter was describing last season. The 7 starts Shedeur made at the end of last year provided a foundation that the offseason has reportedly built on quickly. The sample was small, but it was meaningful, and what it revealed was a quarterback who was operating at a functional professional level despite playing behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league. The 31st ranked pass protection is not a minor detail. It is the kind of context that changes how you read everything else. A quarterback making quick decisions and avoiding pressure behind that line is not just surviving. He is problem-solving in real time. That problem-solving is now being discussed in rooms where last season's criticism used to dominate the conversation. The evaluators who had absorbed Carter's 5th-round framing are reportedly being pushed to reconcile that framing with what they are actually watching. And that reconciliation is producing the same conclusion across different voices and different platforms. Shadeur Sanders is not a project. He is a starting quarterback, and the people who said otherwise are now updating their models. What this means practically for Cleveland is that the distraction of the media narrative, which was real and which did take up oxygen that the team probably would have preferred to spend elsewhere, is dissipating. The story going into this season is no longer whether the critics were right. The story is what Shedeur does with the foundation he has built. He has answered the doubt. The critics have acknowledged it. The organization never wavered. And now the conversation moves to the next phase, which is the one that actually counts. There is a pattern in professional football media that does not get examined often enough, and Shedeur Sanders' story has put it directly under a spotlight. The pattern works like this. A young player enters the league carrying a narrative, something attached to his name before he ever takes a professional snap. It could be about his family, his college program, his personality, his draft position, or some combination of all of them. And once that narrative takes root, it becomes the lens through which every piece of information about that player gets filtered. Good performances get minimized, struggles get amplified, and the narrative feeds itself until something forces it to break. Shedeur Sanders entered the league with one of the heaviest pre-built narratives a young quarterback has carried in recent memory. Son of one of the most polarizing coaches in college football, product of a program that rose dramatically and quickly under his father's direction, beneficiary, in the eyes of some, of a situation specifically engineered to maximize his visibility and his numbers. That framing was established before he took a single snap in a professional setting, and it shaped everything that came after it. What the Carter reversal, the Coward softening, the Ryan reframe, and the Grossi and Cabot shifts collectively reveal is that the narrative was doing most of the heavy lifting last season. The actual tape was secondary. The actual performances were being evaluated through a filter that had already decided what they meant. And filters like that are remarkably resistant to correction, because every piece of contradictory evidence gets absorbed and explained away, rather than allowed to challenge the original conclusion. This is not unique to Shedeur. It has happened to other quarterbacks who entered the league attached to a story that the media had already written. What makes Shedeur's situation distinct is the speed and the visibility of the correction. These are not anonymous analysts quietly updating their internal models. These are major platform voices making public adjustments in real time, and doing it in a way that draws attention to the gap between what they were saying and what the evidence is now showing. That gap is worth taking seriously beyond just this one player's story. Because if a Hall of Fame receiver with decades of football knowledge can spend an entire season repeating a verdict about a player that he formed without doing his own homework, the question becomes, how often does that happen without anyone noticing? How many players have had their careers shaped by narratives that took hold before the evidence was fully in, and never got the kind of correction that Shedeur is now receiving, because they did not have the platform or the performance to force the issue? The honest answer is probably more than anyone in football media is comfortable acknowledging. Shadeur Sanders got his correction because he earned it on the field, and because the organization around him never stopped believing what it saw. Not every player in that position gets both of those things working in their favor at the same time. What Shedeur's story ultimately exposes is that the media machine is not just reporting on football. It is actively shaping how football gets evaluated. And when it gets it this wrong, this publicly, with this many credentialed voices involved, the correction is not just about one quarterback. It is about the whole system, and that conversation is just getting started. Here is the part of this story that will not make it into most breakdowns. The media machine that spent last season manufacturing doubt around Shadeur Sanders did not change its mind because someone asked it to. It changed because the evidence stopped cooperating with the story it was telling. Carter admitted he was wrong. Coward softened. Ryan reversed. Grossi and Cabot updated their reads. One by one, the loudest critics in the building quietly walked out the same door they had loudly entered. And Shedeur never once demanded that they do it. He just kept working. That is the part worth sitting with, not the reversals themselves, but what produced them. A 20-year-old quarterback operating behind a broken offensive line under a national media microscope that spent months questioning everything about him, responded by becoming better. Not louder, better. Whether you think these reversals count as real accountability, or whether you believe the damage from last season deserves a harder reckoning, let us know in the comments. This conversation is not finished. If Gridiron Ground is the kind of coverage you want more of, subscribe and stay locked in, because this story has a long way left to run.
I like the way he's approached the offseason. I like the fact that the coach is really giving this a wide open approach. The best player is going to win.
I'll throw this out there for the doubters. Shedeur started the final 7 games last year for Cleveland, and their offensive line was putrid. It was ranked 31st. He had more touchdown passes in that stretch than Josh Allen.
It's missing. Something's missing with this kid. This kid talks. He runs his mouth like I could be a starting quarterback with his arms crossed like this. Get your ass in the front row and study and do all that. If I know, the whole league knows.